Go ahead and explain it to us.
Well, I'll start with fusion versus fission. Fission is what we have today. The nuclear plants that are operating around the world are all based on fission, which is splitting uranium into two pieces and extracting the energy, the huge amount of energy that results from doing that. Fusion is a hypothetical future possibility where you basically combine two hydrogen atoms, so you fuse them together, and that makes a helium, and that also has a huge amount of energy associated with it. But so far, we have not been capable of reproducing fusion in a controlled way that would produce net energy. It is basically the same thing that is happening in the sun, that the sun is a giant fusion reactor, whereas fission is a separate thing altogether, but it's what we have learned to do, and it is what made it possible to build nuclear weapons, as well as what makes it possible to build nuclear power plants. One of the, I do not think that the fear of nuclear energy is rationally based, and I'll explain why. Let's look at the three accidents that have occurred: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and now Fukushima. Only one of those accidents caused loss of life from radiation, and that was Chernobyl. Now, Chernobyl is truly an exception in that the Soviet Union, during the Cold War, built a class of nuclear reactors that would never have been allowed in the West. It was still behind the Iron Curtain at the time. Western scientists and engineers did not have any influence over the Soviet Union's nuclear energy policy, and they basically took shortcuts and built reactors that not only had no containment structure on them, but had what's called a positive void coefficient, which meant it was possible for the nuclear reaction to run away. In other words, to go critical. And that is what happened at Chernobyl. Chernobyl was not a meltdown accident. It was a runaway nuclear explosion of the core of the reactor and blew the whole top off the thing and blew all the contents into the environment. Now, you mentioned nuclear testing. That is so true. 99% of all of the fission products of the radioactive man-made materials that are in our environment today came from the atmospheric nuclear testing, the cesium-137 and the strontium-90 in particular, which have 30-year half-lives and therefore take 100 years to completely more or less decay, whereas it's only been 60 years, so there's still about a quarter as much of the strontium and cesium as was emitted in those hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests that took place. About 1% of the man-made radiation in our environment comes from Chernobyl. And Fukushima will be in the sort of 0.1% range, something like that. And thankfully at Fukushima, most of the radiation went into the sea, where it will go eventually to marine sediments that will be buried. 3 Mile Island did not harm anyone. That was definitely proven in 5 long-term follow-up studies by universities and hospitals, to the satisfaction of all the leadership in Pennsylvania. There was no harm done to people by 3 Mile Island. It was a big, expensive mechanical failure. I compare it to going down the road in your car and your engine blows up. Well, probably because you forgot to check the oil. Human error. That's what happened at 3 Mile Island too. It wasn't checking the oil, but it was they read the gauge wrong. So human error causes a big mechanical failure. Your engine blows up, you pull off to the side of the road, your family is safe, everything is fine, except it's going to be a big repair bill. That's what 3 Mile Island was. Chernobyl, on the other hand, as I mentioned, and 3 Mile Island was a loss of coolant accident followed by a partial meltdown of the core of the reactor. Chernobyl was a runaway nuclear explosion, was a far more serious event, did cause death. The World Health Organization says 56 deaths can be attributed to the Chernobyl accident. Most of those occurred fighting the fire that raged for a week.
Doesn't this radiation, though, stay in the environment for years? I mean, they're not keeping tabs for years on people getting cancers or anything.
Oh, they most certainly are. They have followed all of the Chernobyl exposed. They were all forcibly removed, and put where they could easily be monitored into giant tenement blocks around the outskirts of Kiev in the Ukraine.
What about hotspots, Patrick? Radioactive hotspots in Europe from Chernobyl?
There are natural radioactive hotspots. For example, in Thailand, there's a place where all the people living there get over 100 times as much radiation from natural hot springs in the background radiation coming out of the earth than we do, for example, in the average place. Well, although the people in Denver, Colorado get a considerable amount more because they live in a mile high, because they're closer to the sun. There's less atmosphere to block the radiation from the sun there. So that we're all exposed to radiation every day. And if, in my book, I explain about how there's a number of theories about radiation. But let's come to Fukushima now, which has released somewhere around 10% as much radiation as Chernobyl did. Most of it, though, to the sea, which is good because it didn't get in the air, that it went into the ocean, where it will settle eventually in sediments and will not be of long-term harm. Whereas on the land, the radiation does remain for a considerable period of time. But the World Health Organization, I go by them. I follow a lot of stuff that WHO does. They are not politicized to the extent that some other UN agencies are. They are very thorough. They base their stuff on actual measurements and science and follow-up studies and that sort of thing.
I don't know, not when it comes to vaccinations, but maybe in what you're talking about. But that's a whole other subject for a whole other time. But anyway, the bottom line is you like them and you trust them and you feel comfortable with what they're reporting.
Do I trust them? But following the Chernobyl accident, a 7-agency Chernobyl Forum was established of 7 UN agencies, plus the governments of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. They are all part of this ongoing committee that has studied the after effects of Chernobyl. The World Health Organization states very clearly that in retrospect, they're not blaming anybody. In retrospect, the worst effect of Chernobyl was the forced relocation of 300,000 plus people into these tenement blocks from their rural homes, where the suicide, divorce, mental illness, cruelty, alcoholism, you name it, the social conditions deteriorated tremendously as a result of basically putting them into projects. And we've seen that happen in the United States, in New York City, in projects.
And with Katrina, sure.
It happened to these people. And they would have been better off if they had been left where they were, because the background radiation only went up a couple of times above normal. There would not have been any serious impact. And in fact, there is no discernible health effect on those 300,000 people in terms of their rate of cancer versus the general population's rate of cancer. The health authorities have stated that very clearly. There is, and you hear Greenpeace saying 90,000 people died and all the children are being born with mutations. These are lies. It's not true. There is no discernible health effect. Now, come to Fukushima and listen to, and you can go on the web and see it. National Public Radio did a little while back an interview with the Radiation Effects Research Foundation in Hiroshima. Now, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation has followed the health histories of 100,000 survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombs, along with 20,000 people whose domiciles were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but who were not home on the day, not in town on the day the bombs were dropped. And those 20,000 people have been used as a control. Now, despite the fact that these 100,000 people, many of them were exposed to extremely high levels of radiation because they were right there and the bomb went off right over their head, the increase in cancer in that population is hardly statistically valid. It is so low. It is like 1% of them. And so even though they were exposed to huge amounts of radiation, so when the Radiation Effects Research Foundation was asked by NPR, why aren't you planning to do a large-scale follow-up study on the health effects of Fukushima? They said it would be pointless because the doses of radiation, like those people were evacuated before the radiation was released, unlike Chernobyl, where people were in the radiation for a long time before they were relocated. And the Soviet Union didn't even acknowledge the fact that there'd been an accident for 2 days. And then it took a week to put the fire out. And meanwhile, these people were all in the plume of radiation going downwind. the people in Fukushima were